I want to speak to you about familiarity versus faith as we see it here in Mark chapter 6. And we see in the first verse that Jesus, after his ministry and his initial success, certainly mostly overwhelmingly success in preaching and teaching, speaking on the kingdom of God, carrying out his miracles, healings, deliverances, and others, he returns to his hometown. This is Nazareth, the town of Nazareth. Now, some of us might go, I thought Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Isn't that his hometown? And that's true. Bethlehem is where he was born and probably where he spent the initial couple of years of his life. But it seems very clearly from the rest of the scriptures and the evidence that he grew up in Nazareth. That's where he grew up for most of his life, in Nazareth. Even though the text doesn't explicitly reference Nazareth, we have the little title that says Nazareth, but that was added by the editors of the Bible. We know from the parallel accounts that this is clearly speaking of Nazareth. And it's very interesting to see what unfolds in this story. It's sort of an anticlimactic story, if you know anything about that. It's when you think the story is going in a particular direction that's going to build and build to a crescendo, and you're going to have this cathartic release. You know, in stories, movies, books have this drive, and then suddenly the story ends in a very sudden or strange way that disappoints you in terms of your expectations, right? That's the idea of the anti-climax. You think you're going to reach the climax of the story, the pinnacle, and actually the story seems to drop before you reach that point. And there's something of that happening in this little story, just a few verses here, but it's actually a very important story. And it's particularly, I want to suggest, an important story when you compare and contrast with what we've just seen in this previous stories, couple of stories, in Mark 5. We looked at Matthew chapter 6 last week with Pastor Ken Matlock, but the week before that we were in Mark 5, and if some of you remember that, it leads obviously directly into this story in chapter 6. But I want us to consider two main things, and the first one is there's the scandal. What's being shown to us here is, and what Mark wants us to see from this story, from this account, is that there is often a scandal when people encounter the true Jesus, the real Jesus, the scandal of the true Jesus. If you picked up a notice sheet, you may have you may have some sermon notes that can help you follow along with me as I teach from this passage. But let's start with the first two verses, okay? We read there, Jesus, went away from there where he just carried out two miracles, the healing of the woman who had the issue of blood, this constant, probably menstruation blood for 12 years. He heals her. She puts her faith in him, and she's healed. And then Jairus' daughter, who has died, and Jesus raises from the dead. Jairus believes Jesus. Jesus encourages his belief, we saw. Jesus goes to Jairus' home. And even though Jesus is mocked, if you remember the story, because he said that the girl was sleeping, not dead, once he takes the mockers out of the room, he goes in with Jairus and his family, and they see this young girl raised from the dead. And this is like, you can't get more miraculous than this. This is one of the points. You can't get more incredible out of this world miraculous story than Jesus raises a girl from the dead. She's died from a disease. Jesus takes her by the hand, essentially says, "My daughter, wake up, sweetie. Talita Kumi, get up." He takes her by the hand, she gets up. No one can believe it. So again, it seems like we're building towards this climax, and suddenly we're going to get this bucket of ice water dumped on us in this story. So he went away from there, from this place, and from this story and these events, verse 1 of chapter 6, and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And verse 2, and on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue. And what we see in verse 2 is that he teaches at the synagogue. That means he comes to what would have been a little bit like, analogous to a local church like this, right? But a Jewish gathering in Nazareth. gathered together, and there was obviously, they'd obviously heard of his reputation. They'd obviously heard about him because they allow him to teach at the synagogue. That wasn't something that just anyone could do. So there was some recognition of Jesus as a teacher, someone who had an ability, a way with handling the Old Testament scriptures, and therefore he's invited to teach there, to read from the scriptures and teach. And so in verse 2, his teaching is strong enough to provoke a reaction. So anyways, as I was saying, in verse 2, if you'll notice, in verse 2 in your Bibles, he teaches, and his teaching and the wisdom with which he teaches is acknowledged. So Jesus, as we've already seen in previous chapters, including chapter 1, whenever he shows up at a synagogue, no one's falling asleep. No one is disinterested. No one is checking their Facebook status, right? No one's checking their Facebook feed. Because he grips people. He teaches with wisdom. He's described as teaching with authority in chapter 1 and with wisdom here. So people are taken aback. Like, this is not your typical teacher. He stands out. So there is that acknowledgement. And there is display of miraculous power. Notice such mighty works done by his hands, probably because, as we've already seen as well, a lot of miracles have to do with Jesus making physical contact with people and touching people, laying his hands on them so they will be healed. So you think from this passage, as we've already seen in Mark in the previous chapters, you think, everyone's going to be thrilled by Jesus, everyone's going to go to Jesus, he's going to be healing a lot of people, delivering a lot of people from spiritual bondage, teaching, people are going to think he's great, amazing, as has happened so far in the Gospel of Mark. So far in the Gospel of Mark, the only people who have an issue with Jesus really are the religious leaders, the religious establishment, the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, essentially people in my line of work, unfortunately and uncomfortably. But outside of people like me, everyone else, Jesus' peers, as it were, other people around him have really been fascinated with him. But what's incredible here is that people are not thrilled with Jesus. What he gets here is skepticism, scandal, discomfort, and rejection. Our Bibles, if you can look at the end of verse 3, at least the version of our pew Bibles, so to speak, the English Standard Version, says they took offense at him. The idea really with offense is scandalized. Okay, it's more than that makes me a little bit uncomfortable. This is, in modern parlance, they're triggered by him. Okay, they're scandalized, they're shocked, they're disturbed by Jesus. And there's some hints as to what's going on here. First of all, they knew Jesus growing up. They describe him. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James? I remember this guy. I remember when this kid was 14. I remember when he was 15. And what's kind of even more shocking is we know from Mark chapter 3 that his family, certainly a big part of his family, of his household, his family members, his brothers and sisters at least, don't believe him. They're also bothered by him. In another gospel, the gospel according to John, chapter 7, verse 5, it says, not even Jesus' brothers believed in him. Not even Jesus' brothers believed in him. And so people have this idea of Jesus that they've seen, this guy that grew up with my kids, that kind of thing. They have a vision of Jesus that was in their midst in this town, really, of Nazareth, a small town. And they're seeing a contrast now with how Jesus is acting now. You can see the contrast on display in verses 2 and 3. Look at verse 2. It says, where did this man get these things, right? This guy. You can honestly imagine looking at Jesus as he's teaching. He goes up and puts his hand on a blind person. They recover their sight, and they're going, wait, this guy? What is the wisdom given to him? You can feel that's where the emphasis lies, on him, right? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter? the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joses, and Judas. Judas there is not Iscariot. It's a different Judas. Also Jude, which I'll come back to, sometimes called Jude, Jude. And Simon. Are not his sisters here with us? So they're shocked. There's a contrast. We remember Jesus growing up in our midst, and we're seeing Jesus saying, teaching, and doing this, and we can't put the pieces together. They don't fit for us. And this is very interesting because this reveals something about Jesus and Jesus' life. You know, we have almost nothing about Jesus' life after his birth story, right? So Matthew and Luke, so there's 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Matthew and Luke give us stories surrounding Jesus' birth. Then, other than a brief incident when he's 12, there's this big gap. There's this jump from his birth to when he's approximately 30 and gets baptized by John the Baptist and starts his ministry. Mark, this gospel that we're looking at right now, and the Gospel of John just goes straight to John the Baptist. John the Baptist baptized Jesus, and we're off to the races. So we don't know a lot about Jesus' life in between. People have tried to figure it out. There's Discovery Channel specials of trying to go into this sort of stuff. But we just don't know. But what we can get from this is Jesus, as he grew up, did not make clear to the world around him who he was. His real identity, purpose, and personhood was veiled. You know, the closest analogy I can think of is, you may find this kind of funny, but in some ways is the Superman story. Now, in my defense, Superman is clearly borrowing a lot from the Jesus story, so Jesus is first, okay? But there is something that's very interesting. If you know something of the Superman story, right? He's this kid from the stars, essentially, right? Who's sent down by his parents because his planet blows up. I know that most of you aren't comic book nerds. Bear with me. Just bear with me. You'll come with me. So he comes and he crashes, and he happens to crash in the land, a farm that belongs to a couple, Jonathan and Martha Kent. Yes, I know their names. And they're farmers, and they happen to not be able to have children. So it's like this marriage made in heaven in that they discover the spaceship, they open it up, there's this young baby. Basically, they can't have kids, so they essentially, functionally adopt him, and he's Clark Kent, right, which is not his real name. I do know his real name. I'm not going to say it, his alien name. Too nerdy. But they call him Clark Kent. And one of the points of the story, and it really came out in the more recent Superman movies, and I thought it was a very, very good point, is Jonathan Kent, his Earth father, as it were, he spends all of Clark Kent's story saying, yes, I know that you can do all these powerful things. You can jump, you can fly, you can see through, you can do all these things, but you can't do it. You can't act in accordance to your powers. You got to hide it. You got to just be this unknown nerdy guy called Clark Kent with the thick glasses, right? And just go through elementary and middle school and high school, and you just can't show yourself to the world. And in the comic books and in the movie, the whole rationale is because if you show yourself to the world, even though you could do great good, the world will probably not understand you and not know what to do with you, which actually bears fruit if you keep watching the movies and the books. So the whole thing about Superman is, as he's growing up, he's sort of veiling, he's hiding who he really is. He can't show himself to his classmates and to his friends and to his teachers and so on and so forth. It's not an exact analogy, but there's a little bit of that going on here. Jesus is who he is. It isn't that he wasn't who he is. And notice they never say, this is a kid who always got into trouble, who always sinned, always. It's not that. It's that he was so ordinary. The carpenter, the brother of James and Jude, we know those guys. Like the ordinariness of who he was growing up, he was so ordinary, lived in such humble estate that it was just too much for them to imagine someone from that background, living in that context, living with us in Nazareth, could possibly also be this guy doing these other things. It was just such a contrast. It was too much. Again, as we would say now, their minds were blown, right? The mind blown emoji. Like this is too much. I can't imagine this. And this reminds us that Jesus was not in a lot of the Jesus movies, he almost looks like he's floating 3 feet above the air. His eyes are rolled to, the back of his head, and he's wide eyes, and he's just spewing wisdom all the time. That's a false understanding of what the incarnation is in the Bible, in Christian thought. That he's like, he's God, but he really only has this like skin sack of a human being, and he's just kind of No. God really became man in the Christian vision. We really have to understand this. Fully everything that it means to become a human being without sin. We just read it from Hebrews 4. That's the only thing that differentiated, importantly, Jesus and his humanity from us. He didn't have a sinful nature. He didn't sin, but he was really fully man. Needed to sleep. We just saw that. Could go hungry. Could be, we'll see later, punched and spat upon and would bleed if you cut. Like, truly, completely human. And his humanity, in a sense, kind of veils his deeper identity or fuller identity of also the Son of God, God the Son, who has come to save humanity. And what I'm saying is, you would see Jesus now, if you could go back in time, you would look upon Jesus and not go, oh, he's definitely a God. No. You would look at him and say, ordinary dude. That's the point. And this is important. This is a theological point about the gospel. God, to come and save us, genuinely humbled himself completely into our condition. Like, the incarnation is genuinely a complete act of almighty, eternal, sovereign, holy, holy, holy God completely going through what it really means to be a person, with all that's involved, even getting bullied by, his former neighbors in his town. Even up until that point. It's what theologians have called the humiliation of Christ. It culminates, we will see, at the cross. The cross is the anti-climax in the sense of, it's the opposite of this cathartic, joyful release at the end of a story when it's a happy ending. It's the end of a horrible tragedy. It's the end point of Christ's descent, but it begins here. He really subjects himself to the full experience of being a person, even to the point of not being recognized as God. And what it tells us is that Jesus was not walking around doing miracles, like as a kid. He wasn't going around doing stuff. There's a false gospel called the Gospel of Thomas, a Gnostic gospel. Gnostics were groups that emerged later, and they were really weird groups, had different ideologies and beliefs. But some of them claimed to be Christian, and they produced their own gospels. And in one of the gospels, Jesus is a kid who makes birds out of mud and then kind of breathes on them, and they turn into real birds and fly away like a little magician, right? And by the way, this same Jesus in that gospel, when he gets mad at people, like strikes them down and kills them. So it's a bad Jesus. It's not a good Jesus. Because some people are like, oh, we've discovered the Gospel of Thomas, and it's the true Jesus. We've known about the Gospel of Thomas for a long time. They haven't discovered it recently. And 2, it's a terrible story, and it's a terrible Jesus. So, don't buy into the hype. History Channel is good, but it does have some bad stuff in there. So he's veiled, and he doesn't really show himself to or begin to show himself as who he really is till after what? Till after he is baptized by John the Baptist in the Jordan. What happens after he comes out of the water? What's described as the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove, with the picture of a dove, comes upon him. And what do we hear? A voice from heaven, from the Father, saying, "This is my Son." The Father and the Spirit reveal Jesus. By the way, that's always true, individually in our experience. The Father and the Spirit reveal Jesus to our hearts. Okay? Now, I know I'm going down into this, but it's important. The author of Hebrews, again, in chapter 2, verse 17, says about Jesus, Jesus, had to be made like his brothers. Brothers here is just other human beings, in every respect. He wasn't 3/4 human, wasn't semi-human, he was human. The author of Hebrews, again, we just read this passage in 4. We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. This is so important. The Christian God is a God who has become a man so that when you are going through your own struggles and you turn to God to pray, you're not praying to God in the clouds, the beard, who's been, filing his nails there for all eternity. And, oh God, I messed up again and I said this stupid thing and I hurt my... And God's like, well, yeah, I guess I'll forgive. This abstracted, conceptual God is not the God of the Bible. What God do you know is that I will come into their reality so that when they come to me with their stuff, the ordinary stuff of life, the junk of life, the ordinary little difficulties of life, there's a God who says, I know exactly what that's like. I can sympathize with you in everything. I didn't sin where you sinned, but I know what it's like to go through that struggle. I know what it's like to go through that trial. I know what it's like to lose a father. Had you ever thought about that? I know what it's like to mourn relatives. As we will see later, I know what it's like to be betrayed by a friend. I know what it's like when I need my friends the most for all of them to scatter and run away and ditch me. I know what it's like to be doing good things and for my own neighbors and people I grow up with I know what it's like. I know what it's like to be tempted to do foolish and wicked things. His temptation in the desert is how things begin with him, remember? Whatever it is, whatever junk is going on in our life, we come to a God in Jesus who what? Who understands. Oh, but I got up that morning and I said that thing, but I was so tired. We come to a God who knows what it's like to wake up tired. I got up and I had a crick in my neck. We know a God who knows what it's like to wake up with a crick in his neck. This is fundamental for the gospel and for Christianity. We have a God who can sympathize with us. We have a God who's come into the muck and mire and the grittiness and messiness of life and can sympathize with us in our struggles. And that is meant to encourage you. When you are struggling, you go to a God who sympathizes with you, who understands you, with whom you can speak freely and joyfully. That's why this is so important. But the cost of that was the people who were familiar with him couldn't make sense of it. So Jesus did that, we know from Hebrews 2 and 4, among other reasons, because he loves you. But there was a cost to him doing that. And the cost was rejection, to be scandalized. It's very interesting. He scandalized the people who knew him or thought they knew him. And here's one of the main points I want us to think about this morning. Isn't that probably the point or one of the major points of the story? In other words, there's a lesson being communicated to us by the Holy Spirit in this story. Jesus summarizes it in verse 4. A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household. This is pretty close to the modern saying, familiarity breeds contempt, right? It's a little bit of what had happened with Jesus himself. He had humbled himself to such a point as a human being that he could be familiar enough to breed contempt in those around him. Isn't that something? And this is a danger, what I think is being addressed here is there's a danger with Jesus, which is you get locked in to a particular view of who Jesus is. Right? We absorb a particular idea about Jesus, or we formulate a particular idea about Jesus in our head, and that's Jesus for us. And what happens is when we are confronted with the actual Jesus, we can't handle, to quote a movie, we can't handle the truth. We're shocked, we're offended, we're scandalized by the real Jesus. We try to domesticate Jesus. We try to have a Jesus that we can handle, we can think of, we can manage. And the real Jesus does not allow himself to be domesticated by us. We can't domesticate the real Jesus. We can't box the real Jesus into our patterns and our way of thinking. This happens to a lot of us, myself included, who've grown up going to church or grown up somewhat active in religious circles. We get a vision of Jesus, and what tends to end up happening is it's a Jesus that's like a nice Jesus. He doesn't bother me. He's there. He's a sweet guy. I like Jesus. He's just kind of there, but there's no personal challenge to my life or my presuppositions. It's a Jesus I can deal with. But when we go deeper into the Scriptures and we see Jesus as he really is, he unveils himself before our eyes, and we get to see what he really is about and who he really is. Like the Nazareth folk, we often recoil. If Jesus is challenging your heart and you're tempted to recoil, you're probably having an encounter with the real Jesus. And if Jesus is familiar enough to breed contempt in your heart, you're probably interacting with the wrong Jesus. You're probably thinking and dealing with the wrong Jesus is the point. And I think many people, perhaps, dare I say, the majority of people who attend to some degree Christian churches, PCA included, have a Nazareth view of Jesus. We like Jesus under certain conditions and categories. For them it was Mary's son, James and Jude's brother, the carpenter. That's what it was for them. For us, it might be a good ethics teacher, a nice religious figure that conveys nice principles through myth, right? Or something like that. Or sometimes we're more theologically orthodox. Yes, Jesus, Son of God, there to help me with my issues, my plans, and my hopes. Jesus, Son of God, God become man, to whom I pay a little bit of attention to once a week, and then Monday to Saturday, it's my life. It's my plans, it's my decisions. Never surrender to this Jesus. I go home and do my thing. And this is where I think this Jesus of the Scriptures has to challenge us a little bit. There is good news if that's who Jesus is for you. There is good news if you're a Nazareth Christian. They mention two people in the story. Isn't this the brother of, there's four brothers mentioned, but two of them are Judas or Jude and James. We know from earlier in Mark, but also in the Gospel of John, right, that Jesus' own brothers did not believe in him. We just mentioned this. They did not believe in him. After Jesus has been rejected, betrayed, abandoned, falsely accused, tortured, killed on a cross, buried, rises again, displays himself to his disciples and followers, and ascends into heaven, after this whole thing happens in his life, we know from the New Testament story as well as other sources that James and Jude end up being key leaders in the church. In fact, we have letters from James. We have a letter from James and a letter from Jude towards the back of the New Testament. In other words, they may have had that contempt for Jesus themselves, but something happened in this whole process where they went from contempt, from that familiarity, to faith, to genuine belief. And so if you are there, that's not an irreversible place to be. And this morning might be the moment where you say to Jesus, okay, Jesus, I want to know who you really are. And I want to put my faith in you, the real Jesus. And I want to have a real relationship with you where you are allowed to scandalize me and to correct me and to challenge me and to change me. The last thing I'll say this morning, the last two verses, is there's also the stifling power of unbelief. Look at verses 5 and 6. He, Jesus, could do no mighty work there, except, so there are a couple exceptions, that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he, Jesus, marveled because of their unbelief. One thing to say here is faith, there's a relationship between faith and the work of God. Faith, that is, trust in Jesus, a belief in Jesus as he has shown himself to be, not as I have made him to be, but genuine belief in Jesus as he has shown himself to be. Faith is ordinarily a requisite to see God mightily at work in our life. It's a requisite. We saw 2 weeks ago, or the other Saturday, at the prayer workshop, that prayer is a requisite to seeing God at work. And that aligns perfectly with this, because prayer is just faith at work. Prayer is just faith expressing itself in our life. Prayer is a request before God that is rooted in faith, in belief in this God. There may be some exceptions, but if you want to see God do great things in your life, see God do great things in your family, see God do great things in your church, you will not ordinarily see it without genuine faith in the genuine Jesus. And we could add, from the prayer workshop, expressed in genuine faithful prayer. It's just not going to happen. That is one of the things that James himself teaches, brother Jesus, who changes and believes. He says, you do not have because you do not ask. He also says, hey, chapter 1 of James, pray, if you don't have wisdom, pray and ask for it. But do not doubt. The one who doubts cannot think he will receive anything. Very interesting. Maybe James read this story about himself. And isn't that one of the lessons we learned from Mark 5? So I know I always say this, but just to make sure you're clear, we're on the same page. We're Mark chapter 6. Before Mark chapter 6 comes what chapter? Good. You're paying attention still. I'm coming to a close. And we saw 2 weeks ago at the end of Mark chapter 5, a woman, 12 years, this issue of blood, of bleeding, of menstrual bleeding that made her ceremoniously and socially impure and ostracized and set apart. And she comes to Jesus and says, if I can only touch the hem of his garment, I will be healed. She touches it, she's healed. And what does Jesus say to her in Mark 5:34? Maybe you can even glance at it and see it in your Bible. In Mark 5:34, he says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. Then this leader, religious leader, Jairus, is worried because, oh my goodness, my daughter's going to die. Same story. My daughter's going to die. And they come to him with a story of, you know what, it's too late. Your daughter has died. Don't trouble the master. Don't trouble Jesus anymore. It's too late. She's died. And we saw 2 weeks ago that Jesus turns to Jairus and says, do not fear. Don't listen to them. Only what? Believe. Have faith. They go to the house. Remember we saw this in the prayer workshop, some of us? They're already mourning. The mourners are there. This girl has died. Jesus says, why are you mourning? She's only asleep. And then what happens? Most of them laugh at him. Scoff and laugh at him. And Tammy Matlack pointed this out. What does Jesus do? He puts them out of the room where the girl is. And only Jairus and his wife and his disciples come, a few disciples come in. Those who what? Have faith, believe. Jesus is not going to perform a miracle like a magician or a sorcerer for people who don't believe. Brings them in, heals the woman. So the point is, Jesus does not ordinarily perform miracles for those who resist him in unbelief. Because he does not want to convey he's performing some sort of magic. Which tells us something about the mighty works that Jesus does. They are expressions, demonstrations of God's saving power. They are expressions of God's saving power. They are evidences that God's kingdom is breaking into the kingdom of this world. Breaking in, breaking through. They are signposts of the kingdom that will be fully realized when Jesus comes again. And these miracles are expressions of God's saving disposition towards people who believe him and who trust him. This is what he wants to do ordinarily in our life. So I'll end with this. I don't think that what's being highlighted here is weak and struggling faith. Okay, the Nazareth crowd aren't struggling with doubt but really want to believe, right? A little later in the Gospel of Mark, there will be someone who comes to Jesus for help, and Jesus says, believe, and this person says, I believe, help my unbelief. I believe, but it's hard. Help me. And Jesus does help him. Jesus is very happy to help people who have extremely weak belief, extremely weak faith. He can work with very weak faith. That's not what's happening here. It's unbelief. It's, this can't be happening. This cannot be true. It's a resistance to understanding who God really is, who Jesus really is. It's a resistance to understanding that Jesus is God himself coming to rescue us from ourselves. It's a refusal to accept that. It's a refusal to accept that God's coming to save us from the consequences of what we've done, which is our brokenness. And what Jesus, and this is where the rubber hits the road for us, what Jesus is calling people to truly understand is who he is, who he really is, and to lay their lives at his feet in utter dependence. Okay, so real faith is putting all your cards down and all your chips in to Jesus. We saw that the other week. When Jairus, the religious leader, goes to Jesus for help, he knows that others are going to hear about it and that he's going to lose his position, probably, of privilege and power and recognition. And he says, I don't care. Jesus, come. Real faith is faith that says, I don't care what the cost is. I don't care what happens as a result of this. Jesus, I need you. Jesus, I can't do this on my own. I surrender my right to be in control over my life, and Jesus, I surrender to you. You need to do this. You need help. I cannot save myself. I cannot help myself. I need you to come into my life. And that's real faith that sees the power of God unleashed. That's the flip side of this story. When there is genuine faith, what do we see in chapter 5? God's power unleashed. God's power unleashed. And this is the scandal of Christianity. If you want to know the ultimate reason why true Christianity is offensive, is that it cannot be experienced without that genuine faith. You can't understand really what is happening in Christianity, what's at its core, what it's really about, until you say, I surrender. Here's my life, Jesus. My life is yours. Until you do that, Christianity, the authentic Bible, the authentic Jesus will be baffling to you, will be a scandal to your life, to your mind, and to your heart. But a faith that surrenders itself completely to Jesus, my life is in your hands, Jesus, unleashes the power of God. Unleashes the power of God. That's what we see right through the Gospel of Mark. It unleashes the presence and power of God. So, where are you? It's nice to talk in the abstract. So now you. Yes, you. No, not the person that you're looking at over. Yeah, that person really needs to hear this message. No, you. Where are you? Has Jesus become so familiar to you that even though you would never say it out loud, because like me, you're a good religious person, you're not supposed to say it, yeah, you've boxed him in. This is what he can do, and this is what he can't do. This is what he can say to me, and this is what he can't cross that line with me. Or does he hold true honor in your heart? Have you embraced the real Jesus and the real gospel with this real faith? The story ends in a really shocking way. It says, he marveled. He was amazed because of their unbelief. May Jesus never be amazed at our unbelief. I think that's the most tragic line in the Bible. That you would surprise the living God with your lack of faith. May he commend us individually and as a church the way he commended the woman in the previous chapter. Your faith has made you well.